Hello, this is Sophia Nakande. We are going to continue with our discussion on causation and remoteness of damage. In this discussion, in this audio, we are going to look at intervening act, or an act which breaks the chain of causation. These acts are normally referred to as novus actus intervenes. In the previous audio, we were saying that in order for the defendant to be liable, it must be shown that the defendant was the cause of the loss or the damage. So the question is, what happens when there is an intervening act, an act which breaks the chain of causation? Okay, so we're going to look at a number of intervening acts, and then we shall see what happens in these different cases. And the examples of the intervening acts includes one, an act of God or other natural events. Number two, sequential causes. Sequential causes, the word sequential comes from the word sequence, to mean what follows. Okay, so sequential causes includes one, a second thought, and two, it could be a supervening illness or a natural event. And the number three, the third intervening act could be multiple causes. So we have three. One, we have act of God or other natural events. Two, we have sequential causes, which includes a second thought and a supervening illness or natural event. And three, we have multiple causes. So we are going to look at these one by one and then see what happens. What happens when the intervening act is an act of God? And what happens when an intervening act is a second thought or an illness? Okay, and what happens when there are multiple causes? So let's go through these one by one. Let's start with the act of God. The general rule is that where there are several potential causes, where some are tortious and some are natural, the claimant can succeed only if he or she proves on a balance of probabilities that the loss or damage is attributable to the tort. I hope that is clear, that if you have two causes, one was a tort and one was a natural event, the claimant can only succeed, the claimant or the plaintiff can only succeed if he shows that it is the tort which caused the loss or damage. I'll give the example of the case. We shall do cases. We shall give cases as examples. We shall look at cases. One is One case is we are going to look at is the Oropesa case. In this case, a collision occurred on the heavy sea between two ships. One was called the Oropesa and the other one was called the Manchester Regiment. And the collision was due to the negligence of the Oropesa. The Manchester Regiment got so seriously damaged that the captain sent 50 of the crew to the Oropesa. An hour later, he set off with 16 of the crew members to go to the Oropesian. This was another lifeboat. Now this lifeboat capsized in the heavy seas and 9 of the crew members drowned. The Manchester Regiment also sank later on. The relatives of the drowned seamen sued, and the issue was whether the action of the captain in leaving the Manchester Regiment broke the chain of causation. It was held that the captain's action was the natural consequence of the emergency which was brought about by the negligence of the Oropesa, and therefore the death of the seamen was a direct consequence of the negligent act of the Oropesa. Court also held that to break the chain of causation, there must be something new, unwarrantable, a new cause which disturbs the sequence of events. And it must be something which can be described as unreasonable. It must be something that can be described as unreasonable, extrinsic, or extraneous. But in this case, you can see that what the captain did was reasonable. It was reasonable because the ship, the Manchester Regiment, was already seriously damaged, and if they had remained, they would all have drowned. They would all have sunk with the ship. So the captain's actions did not break the chain of causation. The other example is the case of Causation steamship. Causation Steamship Company versus Royal Norwegian Government. Here, one boat collided with another, and the one in error admitted liability. Temporary repairs were effected on the damaged boat, with permanent ones to be carried on later. The repaired ship was then declared to be seaworthy and also given a certificate of seaworthiness to continue with its journey. It was also held to be fit to carry dry and perishable cargo. But while it was crossing the Atlantic, the ship encountered heavy weather and sustained serious damage. It was, as a result, declared to be unseaworthy, and it was required to dock immediately so that repairs can be made. Now, it took 10 days to repair the boat, to repair the collision damage. And this means that the ship lost earnings during this period. And they sued for loss and damage, and the issue was whether the first ship was liable for the 10 days loss of earnings. Court held that the loss of earnings was not caused by the collision, but it was actually caused by the bad weather. Okay, so those are the examples, the cases I can give. On act of God or natural, or a natural event as an intervening act. Number 2, we talked about sequential causes, and under this we have a second thought. It could be a second thought, or it could be a supervening illness, an illness which was already there but not known. Okay, in the case of Baker versus Willoughby, here the defendant negligently injured the claimant's leg in a car accident. The claimant was also later on shot in the same leg by some robbers, and the leg was amputated. Court held that the claimant was liable to pay the full compensation for the injury he had caused, even after the period of amputation. The reason behind this holding is that since the accident would have resulted into a disability which would have been permanent anyway, okay, the damages were assessed as if the second event had not occurred, because already the first event was already going to cause a permanent disability. If the chain had been broken, if the chain of causation had been broken, the defendant would not have been liable for damages for the period after the claimant's leg had been amputated. He would have been liable for only the damage caused by the accident, immediately after the accident. The other example is the case of Joblin versus Associated Diaries. Here, the claimant's employer negligently caused a slipped disc, which reduced his earning capacity by a half. 4 years later, he was found to have a pre-existing spinal disease, which was unrelated to the accident and which gradually rendered him unable to work. Court held that the employer's liability was limited to 4 years of loss of earnings. NB, please note, if no additional damage is caused by a second tort, okay, then it means only the first defendant will be liable to compensate for all the damage. But if additional damage is caused by the second tort, then liability is shared between the parties on a pro rata basis. And lastly, the last intervening act, we have multiple causes. So when there are multiple causes for the loss of damage, the burden of proof is on the claimant to prove which of the causes led to the loss of damage. The claimant is also not obliged to sue the defendant whose breach of duty was the main cause of the damage. Okay? He's only required to show that whoever he has sued made a material contribution to the loss or damage suffered by him. Okay, read more cases. Read the case of Smith versus Leach, Brain and Company. This is the case which established the eggshell scar rule. Eggshell scar rule. Skull rule. Okay? That an individual is responsible for the full consequences of his negligence, regardless of the extra or special damage caused by others. That if a man is negligently run over, it is no answer to the sufferer's claim for damage that he would have suffered less injury if he had not had an unusually thin skull or an unusually weak